Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Challenges and Successes in Agile Implementation. We're looking at top Agile challenges, how to overcome them, and the fruits you'll gain from your labor. With our guest today, Greg Burns of BlackLine. Also joining us today from BlackLine is Ben Yosef. I'd like to first tell you a little bit about our company and house rules for today's event. This webinar is presented by XBOSoft. We are a software testing and quality assurance consulting company founded in 2006. We help clients improve their software quality in a variety of industries, from healthcare to finance, doing so from offices in San Francisco, Beijing, and the Netherlands. We'd like to move on to today's house rules. All participants today, aside from our speakers, are in listen-only mode. We do encourage you to post questions in the panel to the right of your screen, and we will try to field them throughout the webinar as well as at the end, depending on our time available. You can also post questions on Twitter to @XBOSoft using hashtag XBOSoftWebinar. We'll make effort to respond to those questions as well, and any we don't get to, we'll direct message or answer via our blog following the webinar. We encourage you to go to our website for that. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email following the event with that information. Next, I want to tell you about our speakers today. First, we have Phil Liu, CEO of XBOSoft, and myself, Carla Smith, Marketing Manager. And now I will pass you on to Phil, who will introduce you to our guest speakers. Phil?
Thanks, Carla. First of all, we're really glad to have Greg Burns with us today from BlackLine. As you can see here, Greg joined the company as a third employee. Greg, how many people does BlackLine have today?
We have close to 400 nationally, and my team has grown to close to 100 altogether.
Wow, from 3 to 400, that's quite a journey. And as a developer, starting off as a developer, I would imagine that you don't, maybe you miss getting your hands as dirty as you used to.
Well, yeah, they still get pretty dirty these days, but yeah, my focus is very different, definitely.
Yeah, okay. We're also glad to have Ron with us. Ron's been with BlackLine for a short time. When did you join BlackLine, Ron?
About a year ago.
Okay, great. And so I guess, BlackLine brought you on as an Agile expert, and we're hoping to get a lot of your experience today in sharing BlackLine's journey. So we're happy to have you here. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. So, I guess, the reason that we're here, XBOSoft has been working with BlackLine for quite a while, since 2008, so I guess I've known you for about 7 years now, Greg. It's hard to believe. And BlackLine has gone through the transformation into Agile, and a lot of companies, as you know, struggle with that transition from waterfall to Agile, and I thought it would be great to have you guys on here to share your experience and some of the bumps that you've had along the way and how you got over them, and share some of your results as well. So that's why we invited you here, and I think what we're going to do today is really just step through some of the typical problems, and then take a look at BlackLine, a while ago, 5 years ago, and then think about the reasons that BlackLine transformed their development process to Agile, and then kind of just have a casual chat, bringing up some questions, some frequently asked questions about Agile, everything from process to changes in the organization and so forth. So I think I'm going to let, so here's a list of some of the typical problems we have, and these are not new, I'm sure, to the audience. But we look forward to having you guys speak about some of these and how you basically conquered them. I think probably on the top of my list is on the bottom one in terms of misguided expectations, and as well as a definition of done. Greg, what would you say would be top of your list that was a hard one for you guys?
There'll be some themes throughout this that'll come up again and again, but I think, one is just really sort of understanding how to use the process in a way that really supports the company's ultimate goal of delivering high quality software, and not getting lost sort of in that and just using process for process sake. And then also having someone who really can understand and drive the implementation of that process. I think there's a lot of people who think they understand Agile or do from previous experiences, but those conflicting voices at times can cause issues. So to have someone who can really own and drive that is critical. But yeah, I mean, as you mentioned before, there are a lot of challenges, certainly.
Yeah. So why don't we go forward now and go into some of the situation that you guys had before Agile? Sure.
Yeah. So I think going back, not as far back as 2001, where we were just really several people, but for a while where the team was a little bit larger, but essentially one development team. I think it was fairly typical of a startup culture where everyone could fit in a room. We talked all the time. It was a relatively flat structure in terms of the reporting structure. We were very close to our clients in the sense that every single one of us at that time was a developer and was on-call support and was a product owner. We all talked to the clients. And just because we were working so quickly and so hard to get the software out the door, we moved incredibly fast. We were really very, very flexible, responded to change very quickly. Documented a little bit, probably should have documented a little bit more in retrospect, but that was part of what got us here. But we were talking, constantly. So I would almost say that we didn't really have a formal process. And I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but one of the things I liked about Agile was it did seem to me that it was sort of it was trying to emulate that startup culture at scale, basically.
Okay. And what were some of the things that made you want to move on to Agile? And I guess you had some problems, and maybe you wanted to get over those problems.
Yeah, there are a few things. There were two main drivers. One was that as the team was growing, we didn't want to lose the relationship with our customer. And we knew at a certain point, developers weren't especially going to be on the phone with our customers. So how could we ensure that we are getting feedback from our customers and responding to that in a timely way, and really being very very in tune with what the business and the market needs. And the other was visibility. Going into a process where anyone could understand and look at what our roadmap was across multiple teams, and to be able to understand where in the process of delivery features were, again, at scale, knowing that we no longer could all be in the same room together. In addition to that, it was really important as we started to hire more and more people, and we really had an explosion in the past several years, but even before that, that the teams had a sense of accountability and ownership over what they were doing. And I'll get a little bit more into that later. But it's incredibly important to me that everyone on our team is really invested and passionate and has a sense of empowerment over what they're building. And that ties in a little bit to the overall philosophy that I care very much about at BlackLine, and that we all do, which is one of constant improvement, of engagement, and of empowerment. And the Agile process really resonated with us in that regard.
Okay, great. This seems like a lot of good reasons to go forward with Agile. I know that there's quite a few Agile methodologies. I know that you guys use Scrum, but what other things did you guys consider? Did you think about the other ones?
Yeah, I'll mention something fairly quickly here and then hand it off to Ron, because I know he spends a lot of time thinking about this even today. But yeah, we don't just use Scrum. Actually, we do use Kanban for one of our teams, and they're called our SWAT team. They're essentially a sort of first line response team to any defects that come out of production, although they do work on some larger projects as well. But for them, we use Kanban because the priorities can shift so quickly, and we really wanted a process there that essentially was a prioritized backlog that we can just work through. There wasn't the same sort of need to time box things into sprints. But Ron, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the different processes we've looked at?
Definitely. So yeah, for sure, we are looking to Scrum, and we are using Scrum mostly in our feature teams. And then Greg just mentioned for support teams, it makes much more sense to use Kanban. But we always look into processes and even Agile methodologies, so we can keep up with what's going on in the market. One of the methodologies we're also looking these days as well is actually Scrumban, which is a combination of Scrum and Kanban. Because we have so much shift of priorities, for some teams, it actually makes sense to use different methodologies. So we are looking into different methodologies all the time. So not only for implementation, but all the time.
And there are times, depending on the kind of work that the team is doing over a period of time, that we may even switch, say, from Scrum to Kanban for basically a sprint or a couple sprints worth of time.
Wow, that's interesting. So here's kind of a typical Scrum lifecycle. Is there anything here that sticks out that you guys do a little bit differently? I know that a lot of people have their own flavor of Scrum or Agile, so maybe you guys do something here a little bit special that works for you.
I'll kind of take a first pass at this, and then Ron, you can jump in. The one thing is, I think this is fairly typical, and really we do, although our terminology may be a little bit different in some cases, we really do everything that you have, that you can see on this slide. One thing to point out, in the sprint review meeting, we make sure to always demo to our stakeholders in that review meeting, and I think that's fairly common, but it's not something that we always did, and I know not all companies do, but to have that checkpoint where people could really see working software and give their feedback at the end of a sprint, which, by the way, for us typically is 2 weeks, is really critical. So that live demo is good. And then we've also added to that the concept of sprint goals. So before a sprint starts, the team actually establishes at a very high level their goals for the sprint. And then in that review / demo, they revisit the goals and agree as to whether or not they were able to meet those goals. And one of the reasons that we did that is we wanted to make sure that everyone had the same expectations, including the stakeholders, in terms of what was going to be delivered that sprint. And with that is very easy to get lost in sort of the technical details and not have that clear understanding. So that's one thing to point out. The other stuff is more around terminology. The sprint grooming meeting, we do backlog grooming. We try to do that in advance of the sprints, just to have a healthy backlog, so that we can we can have a good understanding of estimates in terms of delivery. But yeah, go ahead, Ron, if you see anything else.
I don't think there's a lot to add to what Greg just mentioned. It's there's another thing. It's actually what we do in those meetings, and I'm not going to get into that because we're not going to get into best practices during this session. But the idea is to understand the concept and then make sure you do the right tweaks for your company and for your teams to actually get the best use of those meetings. Because otherwise it can be just another meeting, and we have a lot of meetings using Scrums, so we better get good use of them. So you have to look into the theory, the methodology, and then to make the right tweaks that are right for your team.
That's a great point. I do want to really focus on one thing in particular as an example of that. The retrospective meeting, I think what I've seen is very easy for teams to have a retro where they go through, they talk about what went well, what didn't go well, and it almost becomes like a therapy session, and then nothing changes. So it was really it is really important for us to make sure that we have very clear action items with defined owners for everything that comes out of a retro, and that those things are revisited. Otherwise, we're just wasting people's time.
Exactly. And Greg mentioned that earlier. The idea is to have constant improvement, and retrospective is exactly how you do it. So if you don't have a really good retrospective and just a waste of time, you keep doing the same things, and just the team is getting bored, we're not going to get any better.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, in reference to just a real quick question, in reference to ready release product, I know that you guys, of course, don't release, after every sprint, but I'm wondering, how would you say is your definition of done?
Yeah, that's a good question. For us, and for a little context, we don't release to production at the end of every sprint. We have basically a monthly release cycle, and we're very careful about that because of our clients, the way our software works around sort of the client's financial close. We want to be very careful about introducing change at times that could disrupt their work. However, it is important for us to be in the cadence of releasing at the end of every sprint. So what we're doing is we're actually releasing to a production-like environment at the end of every 2 weeks. And so really for the development organization and the tech org, it is essentially the same thing. It's just that our clients don't see it until it actually goes live to production.
So if I can add to that, we are ending our sprint with potentially shippable increments every time. So that means for us that we have all the unit tests, everything is fully tested, we have all the documentation, we have everything we need to actually ship to production. That's what it means to us. That is our definition of done.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I know that things are fully tested because our guys are definitely working hard for you guys. So let's go to, let's just start a little chat here about, this is a huge question, as we mentioned yesterday when we were discussing this, Greg, but some of your big challenges with respect to these 4 items in organization, people, process, and technology. We'll just kind of step through each of them one by one. And this is this kind of stuff doesn't happen overnight. So how did you guys do this?
Yeah, great. I mean, it's a huge question, so I'll try to be careful with our time here, but also try to hit the major points. So I'm hoping if people need any more clarification, please do ask questions. So the first thing to mention is that when we started, we actually had our teams broken out by skill set. So here, for people that don't know, BE, that's a back-end developer, front-end developer, database, QA, and user experience. And those are just some of the roles that really we wanted in these teams. But so we did a restructure of those teams so that all of those skills were represented in a team, and we actually had a manager at the Agile team level.
Mm-hmm. And how big is the cross-functional team?
We typically will try to keep it between 7 and 9 people. For a number of reasons. One is just sort of as a manager's focus to be able to manage that many people. And also, typically when teams get larger, they tend to split out naturally into separate backlogs. Lots of the work that certainly that we do, it wouldn't make sense to have 5 back-end developers work on anyways. Yeah, so that's really, for us, that's the size that we found to be the most effective. But I should point out that we've structured our processes in a way that we can add resources very quickly, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So if we need to inflate the size of a team to really get something over the wire, we can do that with minimal overhead.
And also shift resources between one team to another, if needed.
Yep.
Yeah, that brings up the next slide is kind of talking about the challenges in the organization, and I'm wondering, you just mentioned that you had like an agile manager as far as changing roles and responsibilities. Is that the same thing as the product owner, or is that the Scrum Master? How does all that work for you guys?
Yeah, that's a good question, and actually one that we did have to spend time making sure that people understood, what those roles really meant. So in a team for us typically is, a couple back-end developers, couple front-end developers, couple QA engineers, and then a dedicated product owner who's responsible for prioritizing and really maintaining the health of the backlog, and then a Scrum Master, a dedicated Scrum Master for the team who can respond to blockers, who can coach people in terms of the process itself, who can make sure that all the meetings are happening and functioning well and the team is healthy. And then the engineering manager is really more about the health of the team itself. So while they do understand and know where things are at in terms of the SDLC, and they're working quite a bit, I mean, they're really joined at the hip with the product owner and the Scrum Master. They're mentoring people. They're having one-on-ones. They're they're making sure people are engaged and that they're there as sort of a support role for the individuals in the team as well. So hopefully that split makes sense. But there is certainly gray area, and that's intentional because we want not just those 3 roles, but we want everyone in the team really having a sense of ownership over what the team's delivering. So I'll kind of keep going here through the slide, and I've already talked about the changing roles and responsibilities a bit. I'll step back and just talk a little bit about sort of the initial phase of getting buy-in for the process change. It's really important to note that when it started for us, it was really sort of a development initiative, and it was important and continues to be important to make sure that we're really fully aligned with all the teams and departments, I should say, outside of development that are as big a part of this, which is specifically product, DevOps, and the other sort of, we call them tech ops, but the other technical teams. So that was a big part, is just that alignment. And then also redefining the SDLC itself. And we talked a little bit about finding which Agile methodology would work best, so certainly coming up with that initial take at which, Scrum, Kanban, which made sense for each team. And working with product to look at the planning phase and the changes there. So, really defining an MVP, or minimum viable product, versus these massive waterfall specs. Making sure we have QA in the teams. I've talked about that, but not just making sure that we have a QA engineer in the team, but that they're step by step with the developers, not only testing the software, but writing the test cases. They're a part of the design. They're really embedded in the team, and all of that tying back to real, true iterative development, so that we can go back to our goals at the end of each sprint, really having things be production ready. But again, to go back to the buy-in, one of the things that we really needed to focus on and really made a case for was having a dedicated Scrum Master and a dedicated product owner per team. And I realized that not all companies may have that luxury. And what I know a lot of people do is they do have to combine roles. I've heard of people having developers who are also Scrum Masters, and certainly I think it's important to find out what works for your company, but it's very important to make sure that those roles are understood for this to work well.
Right. I know that when we used to work with you guys in Waterfall, our process certainly has changed a lot in terms of the testing. How would you say that the testing works now as opposed to before?
Well, before, and actually for a little while as we implemented the process, development would happen for some amount of time, and then it would finish, and then we would QA. And so, before it may be, there was 2 months of development work, and of course the developers were testing their own code, but then after that, QA would go in, they would test for 2 weeks, and we'd fix bugs, and it'd be done. And so there's sort of this in-between phase where we moved to sprints, and what happened at first was we would develop for a sprint, but none of the QA would really happen, and then we would QA in the following sprint, which of course would screw up velocity, and we couldn't really get a good understanding of our estimates and so on. So the real culture shift was really having people understand and coaching people such that so again, the QA engineers are involved in the design. In advance of the development, they could actually start writing their test plans and test cases, and that we're developing in a way in really small increments so that QA could develop could actually test over the course of the sprint. And of course, they're writing automated test cases as well, so there's a fair amount of work. But we've gotten to a point now where all of that work does happen within a sprint, and so at the end of that sprint, it's fully developed and tested.
So here's just kind of a summary of what we were just talking about, Greg. What would you say would be the biggest thing in terms of organizational transformation that happened at BlackLine for you guys that helped you to be successful?
we've hit them kind of on these main points. I think the restructuring of the teams and really defining those roles was probably, I would say, the most important, because once that is set up right, and once the process and the policies around the SDLC are known and understood, the rest just can happen such that the Scrum Master is coaching the team and working with the team, and they're evolving, and they're responding to change and improving. So setting up the teams for success is the most critical thing. And we get into this a little bit later as well, but I would really recommend starting with a team and getting them to a point of being healthy, and then introducing people to those teams and splitting off so that you can start to create these different teams, but you've already established that culture at that point, and then it's just a matter of introducing that into other teams.
So let's move on and talk a little bit about your process and how that has changed and how you've overcome some of your challenges.
Sure. So with iteration planning, there was definitely some work to get, for all of us to get into the mode of using story points instead of hours. Just conceptually, people struggled a little bit at first with what that actually meant. So again, through coaching and honestly just through doing it to a point where it becomes it becomes sort of secondhand, where people aren't thinking about it. That was a big one. Initially, people were breaking out the tickets themselves into skills. So we would have like a user story, for example, for the back-end development work for this particular feature, and really coaching teams to create stories as a business deliverable across all those skill sets. And then, certainly making sure that we're factoring QA, and we've talked about that.
Yeah, a lot of. Oh, sorry, Greg. Go on.
Yeah, go. No, go ahead.
I was going to say a lot of companies have difficulties with unplanned work. How do you guys handle that?
So yeah, that was. I mean, that's always kind of a problem. It doesn't completely go away. It was worse at first because people just had to get used to understanding what it meant to disrupt a sprint. But it's really sort of within the product owner who owns the backlog, right? So if anyone's going to disrupt a sprint, the product owner is the one who should make that call. And initially, a lot of people were going in and disrupting sprints. Like, work was coming from all kinds of different directions. So we really, outside of the team themselves, we had to establish a culture in the entire company that if they wanted a change to a feature, there was one person that they should go to, and that's the product owner. And from there, then they obviously work with a team. Now, the Scrum Master is sort of the one who protects that work. So they may push back on the product owner in some cases. But the point is to come up with a sprint. Again, it's just 2 weeks, right? So the idea that you can plan work in 2 weeks and not disrupt that, and then respond to any change at the end of 2 weeks. But of course, for us, it's important to be flexible. Certainly, if there's some major change that needs to happen very quickly, or we'll do a sprint abort, and we'll just call it at that point. And that's fine as long as the PO really believes that that's critical to do.
You talked about doing the estimates in terms of story points versus hours. Do you guys do the poker thing and using the Fibonacci sequence and so forth, or how do you guys do that?
I can take that.
Yeah,
yeah, definitely. Yes, we are. We're actually using Fibonacci. It works really well for us. It takes some time to understand how to use it and to use reference points and to understand how to size each and every user story using these story points. When you first get to understand what it means to use points, people don't really understand the concept maybe, but you can easily train them to understand we have different sizes, and using Fibonacci, when you understand each number is actually double the previous one, it's easy to understand how to use it. And then going forward, we keep making sure we polish that. We keep working on that and understand we have the same sizes and understanding across the teams, and that really helps us. Other than using hours, that actually keeps changing all the time, right? So in that case, we can actually size it in 3 hours, a task, let's say, and then we'll have to readjust all the time to 4 or 5 hours. It took longer or less. Using points actually help us a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so You know, a lot of people talk about in terms of measuring agile, measuring the process versus measuring any people. So, what would you say would be your top 3 things that you guys measure to make sure you're on track?
I'll have Ron answer that too, but I do want to point out that those metrics measuring the process, it's something that we constantly talk about and revisit. So I do want to point out that we can kind of talk to our top 3 now. But it is something that does change over time and that we revisit and as we develop more and more metrics and really understand what works for us.
Right. So actually, story points we just talked about it is one of the things we measure. We are measuring the velocity of a team. Of course, every team is different than the other, so we're not really comparing the teams, but we are measuring the velocity over time, making sure we actually improve. So the same team actually over time can have more and more output, which is actually why we use Agile, right? This is what we do. We also measure the health of the team. We can do that using the process, using the retrospective, making sure everyone are engaged, everyone actually give us new ideas and proposals, and we actually improve our process at all times is one of the things we also measure. And I think quality is one of the things we definitely measure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that itself can open up a bunch of different other metrics, so I won't get into those, but a couple to name are, how many times do tickets reopen because they're not passing QA, or how many defects are introduced into production that we didn't catch during QA and so on. But yeah, I would say we have a list of probably about 15 metrics that we're working on measuring at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move on here. Oh yeah, one more question about the inconsistency across teams. How many Scrum teams do you guys have? I mean, it must be 7 or 8 or something like that, right?
Actually, currently we're almost at 12.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how do you manage the consistency? Because you want to give the power to the team to do things differently, what works for them, but you also have to have some rules, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So one of the reasons that we adopted Agile is to give people a degree of autonomy and empowerment over what they're doing. So what we're not doing is coming up with hard rules in terms of the process from top to bottom for the teams. But it is important that for us that we can move people in and out of teams with little overhead, as I had mentioned. And so fundamentally, there are things that we wanted to be consistent. And we're always revisiting that to figure out, okay, what is that line between what we want to have be consistent and what we want to empower the teams with? But Ron, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. So this is actually a good point. On one hand, you want to create a consistency across the teams, and on one hand, you don't want to do that. You want to empower them. So for instance, you never want to have consistency across story points, for instance. So we're never going to define how much is 5, let's say, in terms of story points across teams. We're not going to do that. Each team should actually come with their own size or estimation. On the other hand, the use of spikes or the use of tickets. So for instance, Greg earlier mentioned how we use the tickets, and we used to break them into different focus groups. So if we have a team that actually breaks tickets into QA tickets and front-end tickets, this is something we would like to change and actually create consistency across the teams. So it's major guidelines or framework that we want to create across our teams, nothing else. We still want to empower them, and this is what Agile is all about, right? Empower the team and let them speak up and come up with their own process and autonomy.
Yeah, and the hope, to add on there, the hope is that as we see the teams themselves mature their own processes, there's almost this viral thing that happens where other teams will start to adopt that, and we'll see that consistency take shape just because people believe in the ideas. Mm-hmm. That's the ideal. Yeah.
Okay. When it comes to, this is just kind of a summary slide, I was just wondering about, you talked about estimating and your story points and so forth. What about the involvement of the product owner? Some companies really struggle with that, what the role of the product owner is and their involvement, and sometimes, the product owner doesn't even show up for meetings, So how do you guys handle that?
Yeah, so for us, the product owner, they're critical for the team. We really believe that, and certainly here we found that that's true, and that's why we've really we've really worked a lot on getting buy-in for a dedicated PO for each team. Not only do they own the priority of the backlog, but they should understand the business. They should be an expert in their business vertical, and certainly engage with people outside of the team to understand what those changes are that they would consider important to the future. Again, those sort of the stakeholders, right? But for us, they're sitting with the team. They're constantly talking to the team. They're not a separate entity at all. And we really believe that the successes or failures of the team span the sort of typical development group as well as the product owner and the managers. And I'll talk a little bit here. You had mentioned sort of this third bullet point in terms of breaking up projects into epics and user stories. That work of creating epics and user stories is something that doesn't belong to the product owner. Now, of course, they're talking to the team. They're getting their input, and so. But the idea is that is really their responsibility in terms of creating those artifacts.
What about cadence? What would you say? How do you maintain the cadence across all the different Scrum teams? Do they all have the same 2-week cycle?
They don't. It's something that we do talk about and revisit, especially as we look at having those 2-week deliverables into our production-like environment. But right now, we can actually release on a weekly basis, so we can support different sprint teams having different sprint cycles. So we haven't at this point enforced a consistent sprint cycle. And the idea is that out of those releases, we generate these release candidates that are ready to go to production. So it may just be if one team is offset by a sprint, there's a week's worth of work maybe that wouldn't get in to release candidate, but they would be in advance of that at the beginning of the release cycle, if that makes sense. So it works fine for us that way.
Okay. Let's move on to people. I guess one of the big things is getting people on board. How did you guys handle that?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we first started, I got a lot of feedback saying that people were going to hate Agile and they're just going to be totally against it. I found that generally people just shifted into it. I think it's becoming more and more commonplace in that there wasn't sort of an outright revolution in any sense. There was the bigger thing was just sort of some confusion in terms of what Agile really was in practice, and then some difference of opinion, which would also add to that confusion. So it goes back to having one person who could really own the implementation, and coaching people in that regard. So you have a second bullet point here, training, and there's a lot there. I want to point out that the training for us is not. There's a lot of we have a huge application. It covers a lot of scope in terms of the financial close. So there's training certainly in terms of the business, but for Agile, we're really focused on the coaching of the team, right? And I know it may seem like semantics a little bit, but the idea that the team again has a voice in this, and that the Scrum Master is a coach to those teams, so they're working with them to make sure that they understand what the process is, right? So I did want to point that out. But generally, the shift in culture, frankly, it was just one that had to take time. There's no way that I could see around that. And yeah, there's some tips we have, like back to having a team be sort of a POC for this, that can help. But ultimately, people, and I believe this is any real cultural change, they have to experience it and live in that. And for us, it took months, if not years, for people, especially as we were growing and adding more teams and new people, for people to really sort of really be able to live in that and not constantly be thinking about what Agile meant. But I think we're at a point now where it is the process and it's secondary, and people are focused on their work rather than the process itself.
Right. Talking about team growth and recruitment, do you find that you need to recruit different types of people to fit in to work with an Agile process?
It's an interesting question.
I'd say yes.
Yeah.
I would say yes. Maybe we have different opinions about that, but I would say because Agile is is about the team, right? And it's about empowerment. So it means you need a lot of trust of the people you actually hire, and you have to make sure the people you hire are team players, right? So they can work in a team and understanding this is a team concept company. So yeah, I think there is a shift in our recruitment in a way and how we look on our candidates. Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, I agree. Those are really good points. Yeah, we certainly, ideally people are intrinsically motivated and they're collaborators and negotiators. And that is something that we look for. And I also want to mention when we hire Scrum Masters, for us, we do look for people who aren't just these Agile evangelists, and they just, we want people who can think outside the box. And we love when people come in and challenge the fact that we're using Agile at all, because we're constantly doing that ourselves. So yeah, it certainly became a big part of our recruitment. I do want to talk about the growth and recruitment itself in terms of the team size. I mean, we experienced massive growth over the past couple of years, and so we did have to pay very close attention to the balance as we got more and more new people in terms of their understanding of the process itself. And that just took a lot of work, to as we bring people in to make sure that they have the coaching and the understanding, but also that they know that their ideas will be heard, and it's even at the process level.
And so when you bring a new person in or some new folks in, is it just kind of OJT? Do they get just put on a team, or do you guys have some type of process training that you require them to go through?
So we're actually building out some formal training mechanisms in a number of areas. We currently don't have a true sort of formal process training. However, they are brought in and they work directly. I mean, they're going to work with the team anyways, but they're really paired up with people in a way that they can be walked through and understand what the process is. And then on top of that, we have formal onboarding programs for the technical pieces and certainly for the business itself.
Right. That's interesting. Kind of have a mentor, I guess you could say.
Yeah, but there could be a series of mentors, but certainly the Scrum Master is one of the mentors for anyone coming into the team. Do you have something to add, Ron?
Yeah, we do have sometimes if we're creating a new team, or we are trying to make sure the onboarding is being done with a strong team, even for a sprint or two, and then they are being sent to their original team. So they are doing some sort of onboarding with a very strong team, so they can understand the concept, they can see Agile in action and how we do the process around here, and only then they are being sent to their team.
And that's true of offshore teams as well. So one of the things we did is we started to bring on offshore teams is we started by working very, very closely with one initial offshore team and then positioning them to be able to coach other teams as they were brought on. And certainly we would still be involved, but that was important. So it's almost like there are two teams here where the process is running really well, it's very well understood, and so we'll put people in there for a sprint, maybe two, in either an internal team or an offshore team.
Yeah, I know that this kind of combines both of them. We work with you guys offshore doing a lot of your QA work, and in terms of the recruitment, we have to hire a totally different kind of person to work with you using Agile versus back in the old days with Waterfall. Our guys have to really, like you said, they're really team players, and they have to communicate and talk a lot. They're working every hour with you guys, or waiting at night and talking to you guys. It's a much different kind of person than a normal QA guy from 10 years ago that would just kind of go into his cube and do his thing.
Yep. And when I look at certainly our relationship with you, one of the things that's worked really well is that each of the teams basically has a point to talk to, right. And that relationship is really, really healthy. It works very well, and that's one thing that I really believe is critical. Certainly, as you add more and more offshore teams, to have each of those teams have a point of connection there.
Right. Okay, so this is just kind of a summary slide here. Is there anything in particular that you want to hone in on that you think is really crucial for the people and culture part?
We've really hit on this stuff. I think we can move forward pretty quickly. I mean, it's really just going back to the culture of collaboration, making sure people are coached, and there's a comment here in terms of how to handle the unknown and estimation, but really having that be a rote part of the process where people understand what it means to disrupt a sprint and so on. But yeah, if the team is structured well and coached well, all of the rest will happen, and that's really the starting point.
Okay. What about technology stuff? You know, I mean, obviously you had to change some tools or use tools differently for sure. How did you guys handle that?
Yeah, there's a first bullet point that's interesting, and I wanted to point out why it's in technology. So, you know, it's really working within a sprint, and the prioritization of the PO. So having the right tool to support that is critical. One of the things I would really caution people is not to let the tool drive the process. At a certain point, we were working with a tool that, because of some limitations, it was changing the way that we were actually doing things at BlackLine. And we ended up shifting gears altogether. And now we use a lot of the Atlassian tools. Jira is a big one. It's very flexible. It supports multiple methodologies, and you know, we really found that it can flex in a way that we need. But the visibility is there in terms of the prioritization for the PO. We're looking at a tool called Jira Portfolio, which actually really helps in that regard. It's almost like the product owner's home in terms of priority and visibility across roadmaps. And so I'd encourage people to look at that. I'm sure there are plenty of other tools that would accomplish the same, but those are the ones that we feel really good about. You know, what else? Like I think it's important to note that we had to change our branching model to support our agile development and the 2-week sort of deliverables at the end of a sprint. And so implementing Git and a branching model that could support work in smaller chunks, you know, using tools for continuous integration and deployment, you know, such as Jenkins and Chef, and also building out the tools for the QA automation piece is huge, and visibility into that. One of the things that we're doing through Jira is we're able, in a Jira user story, to look at all the development work, look at all of the commits from the developers, look at all of the test cases and successful pass or failure of the test cases within the story. So it makes it very easy for a product owner to not even have to be technical and look at the health of a user story across the board.
And even documentation if needed.
And documentation, absolutely, yeah. And that's a great point. Like, again, back to Jira, making sure that, and it supports this as well, but it takes some, you know, there's always going to be some manual element to making sure that the content is right, but that the tickets have the acceptance criteria, definition of done, and so on. And one other thing I'll mention here is the communication piece. And look, by the way, if people have questions about our tools, I'm happy to talk more to it. But again, this is what's worked well for us. So, you know, certainly take the time and POC things to make sure that they work well for you. The communication piece, there was a shift and continues to be a shift to just get out of email. I prefer not to use email at all, right? So the communication should ideally happen in the tickets themselves, in the documentation associated with that, which we use Confluence as a wiki, so it's easy to link to. Again, it's another Atlassian tool, so it's easy to link to Jira, but also in the code reviews themselves, having that commentary, and using tools like, you know, HipChat or Slack that are really, in my opinion, much better means in terms of communication, because the history is there, the documentation is there for reference, and certainly when working with offshore teams, to be able to have that, so someone can just log into HipChat and be able to look back at what happened during their night, and have that as a reference. I think it's just really has been really useful.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, do you guys use Confluence for requirements or blueprints, stuff like that, or how do you guys handle requirements?
Yeah, everything's in Confluence, and then we'll link to that from Jira.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, on to, you know, you guys have been down the Agile road. You know, what kinds of things do you think that you would have done differently?
So we've really hit on these for the most part. So I think hopefully I didn't give anyone the impression that everything we mentioned here are things that we did right at the beginning. The Agile training is a big one. When we started, there wasn't sort of one person to really own the implementation. So going back to that, in retrospect, I really would have had one person gone through some really, a lot of training and really made sure that they understood the challenges that are specific to BlackLine and kind of looking at that process a little more holistically, but one person really owning that. And then coming up with a plan across departments to transition. So not just for development, but for development and product and any other technology departments that you have. For us, DevOps is outside of development, as an example.
Can I add just one thing to that?
Sure.
I think we didn't mention that enough, I think, but the stakeholders of the company should have some sort of agile training or understanding. This is really, really important because it's all about setting expectations, and they have to understand the new process if you take an agile for the first time, and because they have a role in agile as well, and they have to understand the role as well. So yeah, some training for them will be very, very valuable, also for a buyer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point, because it took a while for us to get people outside of technology to understand what Agile even was, and that they should be talking to their PO instead of firing off an email to a developer that they have a relationship with. Things like that can be really disruptive. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the training. I think my experience was there were a lot of people in my organization that understood Agile to a degree. And it's not that they're not smart people. It's not that they didn't understand the process well, but to really, really make sure that someone is coaching everyone and that we have a sort of a unified message for what Agile is at BlackLine, it would have saved us a lot of pain, because it would have gotten us buy-in at the top level across all these departments in a way that we could have done sort of a cultural transformation across the board through messaging, through training and coaching. And yeah, that would have been a game changer.
Yeah, well, let's talk about a little bit about your process today. You've gone through this, and you talked about getting other stakeholders involved, and what else do you have to add as far as what your process is right now and where you're going?
Ron, I know this is where you spend most of your time. So
right, definitely. So currently we have Agile, right? We are using it in our feature teams, even the support teams. We are using it, but not to the extent that we want. And as we said, Agile is all about constant improvement, and we have to identify the gaps that we still have and make sure we improve with them, and even create more consistency around the guidelines, the general guidelines of what Agile means for BlackLine. So we are still working on that. We are also working to get a buy-in for special dedicated roles in BlackLine. Even the stakeholders to some extent, and working with product to make sure we're on the same page here about Agile and how we use it and what are the expectations that development have from product and vice versa. So we are still doing that, and we're also redefining our business verticals. We're thinking even about some sort of reorganization in 2016, mini reorganization, I should say, maybe changing the teams or the roles of what they should do, so we can be much more productive. So we keep looking into our processes, we keep looking into our teams, we are making sure we are meeting our needs at all times. So this is what we go for.
Yeah, and something, I worry we glossed over this, but something that was really important for us, maybe not important to other companies, but to have teams tied directly to a business vertical, certainly with an application that has the scope of ours, was really important. So as we build more and more feature sets, and we call them modules, but essentially new products, we need to look at how to redefine those business verticals to support those new products, and that actually drives our recruitment for the next year in a lot of ways. And so that's really important, because without that, it is hard to get that ownership and accountability if people are working over a bunch of areas of the application. They're not feeling a real sense of ownership over, say, these 1 or 2 or 3 products. Yeah,
I mean, that's interesting. So you guys, do you have to have a lot of product or domain-based training for your people in the development team? I mean, you can't really expect a coder to know a lot about accounts receivable, can you?
Yeah, that's a real it's a real challenge, and certainly we don't expect for the entire team to become product experts, but there are people within the team that we really focus on that training. So certainly the product owner, clearly, right? But also the engineering manager, and then a tech lead for the team. They're expected to have a really high degree of understanding of the product, and then the rest of the team does have training. It's just not as formal. Because it's expected at that point that they're working very closely with the product owner, et cetera, and that over time they will sort of garner that experience and that understanding. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and again, I don't expect that this would be the case at other companies. Certainly plenty. I'm sure we'll have the same challenge though. But as we've scaled, making sure that we understand what types of training in terms of the business itself are required for an Agile team, and how the Agile team can support itself in that regard had played a huge role and continues to play a huge role.
So I think we've kind of covered most of these already. Is there anyone here that sticks out to you that you think that deserves a little more attention?
The one thing to point out, yeah, we've really covered these. The embedding service groups, which is the second to last bullet point there, DevOps, database UX. So there are certain roles in the team that we don't have designated, or I'm sorry, that haven't embedded fully into the teams. And it's just that we found that in certain cases, we don't need a full-time DevOps person. And really our DevOps team they're building the tools so that our teams can basically do all of the work they need to do to get things to be production ready. So while we may not always embed some of these resources, we do always have a dedicated point for the team so they know who to go for. And we really and that's something we're always revisiting, as Ron mentioned, because we really want to be conscious of reducing bottlenecks and overheads and approval processes and setting up these teams to have everything they need to be successful.
I'd like to add another point. We've mentioned a couple of times the term team, right? Because Agile is a lot about team. It's about empowerment. And a key factor for the success of a team is communication. And that is our third bullet point in here. We have to make sure we have common language around the team so we can have good communication, so we can have a strong team as well. So if we have terms that we are using, such as MVP, which is actually more of a lean practice, and we have certain type of tickets, for instance, spikes, we use that. We have to make sure we have the same understanding across the team and sometimes across the teams, so we can have good communication around that.
Yeah, MVP, that's most valuable player, right?
Oh yeah. It's a minimal valuable product, obviously, and it's more of a lean practice, and I can emphasize it actually helps us a lot to make sure we are focused on what we should deliver and time to market and so on, and that's what makes a lot of difference from waterfall to Agile.
I think you just made Ron bristle a little bit. Yeah. This should have been a video conference.
So one last, if you guys could offer, a few tidbits of advice for, organizations that are moving on to Agile, maybe you guys could share some of your wisdom here.
Sure. So, we've picked kind of our top few, and we'll be a little redundant, but again, this is all based on the assumption that you decided to use Agile at all, because that's the first thing is, take the time to figure out what process is going to work best for you. It may not be any of the Agile methodologies. But that said, the first thing is, don't forget the ultimate goal of just delivering software, or in fact, define your goal, right? For us, it was being able to deliver high quality software frequently and being responsive to our clients. So don't forget that goal, and don't let process get in the way of that, even if you have to bend the rules of what the process is. The second is just, I'm going to drive this one to death, but pick a clear owner for the Agile implementation. Make sure they have the training that they need. The third one is, and this goes back to the owner, but we don't expect to ever reach the state of being done with the implementation. It takes constant nurturing and attention, and so to have that owner established and paying attention to that, and all of the Scrum Masters really paying attention to that as well. And then lastly, the org structure and how that will shift across not only teams but departments is critical. So spend a lot of time, make sure that you're aligned with those teams and those departments, and think really holistically in terms of how to execute in terms of the implementation.
Okay. Ron, did you have any closing tidbits?
Yeah, just one more thing. I think we've mentioned it in other words, but Agile is about keep moving, keep improving all the time, just doing and revisit and make sure you're using the best process for yourself. So we are always working on our Agile, and now we use it here in BlackLine, and I don't think we'll ever be done with it, ever, because that's part of the process. This is what it's all about, and it's about the team and it's about the people, and I think empowering them can help a lot. You gain a lot of commitment from them, and you know what? If you ask me, we have higher performance using Agile, for sure. So when people feel responsible and committed, they can perform better, and when you hear their voice, they can perform better, and this is what we do here, and this is why we do it. So yeah, that'll probably be my closing statement.
Okay, great. I guess I'll turn it over to Carla to close up here. Thanks a lot, guys, for being on the webinar and sharing your experience and expertise. It's been it certainly has been great to hear all the tidbits that you have to offer for us. Carla?
Great. Thanks so much, Phil. Thanks so much to you and Greg and Ron for a really terrific and informative hour today. I think we might have had a few questions come in. We'll be sure to get to those via blogs, so all participants be sure to watch for that response over the next few days. Thank you all very much for attending our webinar today. You will be hearing from us in the next few days with links to the recording and the slideshow, and any responses to questions as well. Watch for information as well on next month's webinar on testing metrics, which will be coming up on Wednesday, January 20th. We do appreciate your feedback, so do drop us a brief email at services@xbosoft.com to let us know your thoughts about today's webinar. Thank you all very much. Have a terrific day. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you.